Okay, so we're going to talk about essentially the last 40 years. Let's start with where we came in. Now, the truth of the matter is, precision guidance was attempted during the Second World War. Most people don't know it, but we actually had TV-guided bombs at the end of the Second World War. They didn't work that well, but people were already trying to figure out how to make bombs smart. And the first clear practical demonstration of this effort came in the Vietnam War. I remember this news item. I'm old enough to remember this. It was, I don't know that I can pronounce the bridge precisely. Than Ho Bridge. I probably slaughtered that. I apologize. My Vietnamese is not very good. But this bridge was very important, and so much so, there were 800 failed bombing runs to try to knock this thing out. What you had to do is knock out one of the pillars. Couldn't do it. Then they finally figured out how to get a laser designator on the front end of that bomb, which you can see under that F4, right-hand corner. Well, yeah, there you go. There's the bomber. There's the bomb. And on the front end, you'll notice it has fins, and on the back end, it has fins. And if you could get someone to point a laser at the point you wanted to bring down, you only needed one bomb, and in 8 runs, they brought this bridge down. And when this occurred, it was published in the newspapers. This was like landing on the moon for military science. Now, what it prompted almost immediately was some discussion of, well, what does this mean? There was a man at RAND who I had the privilege to get to know, I got to know him dealing with something entirely different. But his name was Mr. Digby, James Digby. And he wrote a very, very interesting paper. Why don't we go to the next page? And that paper at RAND was Precision Guided Munitions Capabilities and Considerations in June of '74. He turned it into an Adelphi paper with IISS, which is much, much easier to access. It came out the following year. But this paper, I think, still today, amongst the people who theorize about missile wars, is the paper. It is, if you will, it's the Clausewitzian treatment of this topic. It's Sun Tzu for missiles, and I can't encourage anyone who's interested in this topic more to read it, because it really is worth struggling with, and it's pretty accessible paper. In any case, initially, many of the things in this paper, and we'll discuss it with the next slide. Why don't you jump to that, Bailey? Initially, there were meaningful demonstration of a lot of the points in Mr. Digby's paper. The use of munitions was highly lethal. You'll notice at the top image, those are shelters for aircraft in Desert Storm that were Iraqi. And you'll notice they have a hole right at the top. One hole. That's it. Then we have the Israeli raid on Al-Kabar, which was admittedly a standoff bombing, but very precise. And you have damage right in the center of the reactor. And they didn't have to do more than one raid, which is just remarkable. And then you have the Tomahawks that Mr. Obama and Mr. Trump fired at a variety of targets in Syria, as well as the Russian complement. I mean, they had, Tomahawksky, if you will, being fired. And all of these things demonstrated points that Mr. Digby had raised in his paper, 30, 40 years before. Highly lethal, enormous probability of kill, very high, almost 100%. Low collateral damage. In the case of Desert Storm and its sequel, super high rates of fire. Also, this was the case in the Balkan Wars in the '90s, and in the case of the war against Iraq, a very quick and paced of operation. I mean, the wars initially lasted very, very short period of time, a matter of days or weeks. None of these attacks, though, were against states that either had active missile defenses or long range precision weaponry to conduct counterstrikes. So there was a lot in the paper that Mr. Digby writes about that, well, we're only lifting the veil on, but we are lifting it. And that brings us to the next slide. This attack last year, how many of you, read about this? I hope some of you, are reading Google News on a daily basis. This was truly a remarkable event. I would say watershed. And it was a watershed event. It was a strike by what we think, probably was Iranian missiles. If not done by Iranians, the missiles were Iranian, and at least inspired and designed by Iranians, and may very well have been fired by Iranians for all we know. But that's not interesting. What's interesting is these missiles, and these are just 4. I think there were 12 or 13 that hit their targets. Were fired against a Saudi oil processing plant, and they hit some storage tanks, among other things. You'll notice that the storage tanks are hit in the exact same location. The Israeli analysts that looked at this believe they call it CEP, the Center of Error Probable, the circle within which half of the missiles come closest to the aim point, was 1 meter. 1 meter. Okay, well, that's kind of astounding, but that isn't what's interesting. What's interesting is what you can't see. And that is that these missiles penetrated through 3 layers of missile defenses. A U.S. Patriot system, a German Skyguard system, and the French Shahin system. And at the time, it didn't get much notice. The Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Mr. Rood, in the U.S. said, well, we shouldn't snicker at the Saudis for not having even engaged the target. None of these systems even engaged these missiles. He said, it's my view that NATO wouldn't have done any better, and that NATO's not prepared for this kind of attack. Well, okay, game on. Let's think about what this might mean.